The city was a husk now. He remembered a time before, when he helped build it, a long time ago now. Broken towers of steel and glass stretched like jagged ribs from the carcass. The once promising landscape turned into an almost unnavigable disaster. In the distance, the orbital elevator, a miracle of engineering, loomed, a white monolith disappearing into the heavens. Once a thin lifeline to space, it now stood as a grim reminder of better days. Mack crouched in the shadows of a ruined street, his hands deftly working to pry a bundle of copper wires from a crumbling junction box. The tang of rust and mildew filled the air. His gloves, worn and thin, barely shielded him from the sharp edges of corroded metal. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, the sticky grit of the city's dust clinging to his skin. The wires, when finally freed, gleamed dully in the faint light. But something caught his eye, a strand cut cleanly, as though sliced with surgical precision. Mack frowned, holding the severed end closer. No jagged edges, no fraying insulation. This was no scavenger's work. He ran his thumb over the cut. "Too clean," he muttered. The last time he'd seen cuts like these was years ago, back when he still wore a contractor's badge and ran diagnostics on freshly installed systems. Whoever had been here wasn't using makeshift tools or brute force. This was corporate-grade work, or something else. A shiver ran through him, though the air was warm and still. He scanned the ruins around him, feeling exposed. It wasn't unusual for scavengers to run into each other, and such encounters rarely ended well. But this felt different. The faint metallic taste of adrenaline bloomed in his mouth as he stashed the wires in his bag. "Time to find quieter pickings," he said to himself, heading toward a part of the city he'd saved for emergencies, a place he knew others wouldn't go. The underground zone was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against his eardrums and amplified his own breathing. Mack squeezed through a rusted maintenance hatch, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. The tunnels smelled faintly of ozone and damp concrete, a scent that dredged up memories of better days. He worked methodically, stripping wires and unscrewing industrial capacitors. Each satisfying clink of metal added to his haul. This area had been untouched for years. He smiled to himself, the first glimmer of optimism he'd felt in days. Then he heard it. A faint, high-pitched whistle, soft and distant, but unnervingly deliberate. Mack froze, his hand still gripping a thick cable. The whistle came again, louder this time, echoing through the tunnels in irregular bursts. It wasn't wind. Wind didn't whistle with such intent. The pitch changes too abrupt, like a musical instrument, but one he'd never heard before. His flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to writhe in the corners of his vision. Mack cursed under his breath, shaking the light until it steadied. The whistle stopped. The silence returned, heavier now, as if the tunnels themselves were holding their breath. Mack's fingers tightened around his tools. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but curiosity rooted him in place. He swept the beam of his flashlight down the tunnel and froze. Something moved. A flash of glossy black, like polished obsidian, slid into the edge of his vision. It was fast, too fast to follow. Mack's pulse hammered in his ears. He took a step back, his boots scraping against the concrete. The whistle resumed, closer now, and more melodic, as if mocking his fear. He turned and ran. The tunnels twisted and turned, a maze of decaying infrastructure. Mack's every step sent echoes bouncing off the walls, a cacophony that seemed to follow him. The whistling grew louder, weaving into a discordant symphony. He didn't dare look back. His lungs burned as he climbed a ladder and burst into the open air. The city felt no safer, but at least here he had his traps. Mack's safe house wasn't much, just a fortified husk of a building surrounded by booby traps. Wires snaked from capacitors to hidden tripwires and electrified barriers, all cobbled together from his days as an electrician. They weren't pretty, but they worked. He slammed the reinforced door shut and threw the bolts, his chest heaving. He listened, straining to hear over his ragged breaths. Then it came again, the whistle, faint but unrelenting. It wasn't alone now. Two tones overlapped, harmonizing in an eerie alien cadence. Mack activated his traps, the hiss and hum of charged wires filling the air. He backed away from the door, gripping a makeshift weapon, a heavy wrench. The first creature appeared moments later. Its glossy, beetle-like shell reflected the dim light. It moved with a smooth, fluid precision, its 3 legs and 3 arms rotating as it approached, its triangular head tilted sharply to the side, black and inscrutable. The whistle it emitted seemed to resonate from deep within its chest. Mack started, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. The creature paused at the edge of his traps, studying the setup with an almost mechanical focus. Then it moved forward. The electrified wire snapped to life, arcing blue sparks. The creature seized and collapsed, its limbs twitching. Faint lines of bioluminescent blood seeped from its body, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Mack felt a grim satisfaction, but his relief was short-lived. The second alien emerged, stepping over its fallen companion. This one was different. It stopped to examine the electrified wire, tilting its head. Then, with surgical precision, it used one of its sharp, scalpel-like fingers to quickly sever the power source. Max swore as he heard much of the hum from his traps fade. He watched on a monitor as the creature rotated its limbs, then began climbing. His entire defense plans had been predicated on the assumption he would be fighting humans. Although it wasn't impossible, the likelihood that someone would try to enter from one of the metal industrial vents 20 feet up the otherwise bare concrete wall hadn't occurred to him. With the same eerie precision, the insect thing clipped through each of the metal slats of the vent, and they clattered loudly on the hard gray floor, each one counting down to the next attack. With a fluid grace, it emerged through the opening and dropped almost silently to the floor, a faint clicking as its 3 pointed legs made contact with the floor. It tilted its head again, far beyond a human's range of motion, and resumed the whistling sound. Its whistle was softer now, almost contemplative, as it slowly approached him. Mack swung his wrench, aiming for its head, but the alien deflected the blow with a swift, effortless motion. It grabbed him with 2 arms, pinning him against the wall. The whistle shifted to a lower, mournful tone as the alien tilted its head, studying him. Its 3rd arm extended, fingers branching out into delicate, feeler-like tendrils. They brushed against Mack's leg, sending a shiver down his spine. Then the scalpel finger emerged. Pain exploded through him as the alien cut into his leg with chilling precision. Blood poured from the wound, warm and sticky against his skin. Mack screamed, thrashing uselessly against the creature's grip. The whistle continued, rhythmic and calm, as if the alien was conducting a macabre experiment. His hand brushed against a live cable on the floor. It was part of a trap that hadn't been completed yet. The other end of the trap was a metal plate they were both standing on. Desperation overrode the pain. He jerked his leg away from the monster's scalpel, cutting deep curved grooves into his leg. Mack grabbed the cable and thrust it into the alien's torso. The jolt was immediate. The creature convulsed, its whistle turning into a shrill, distorted shriek. Bioluminescent blood sprayed in arcs, illuminating the room in ghastly blues and greens. The alien released him, collapsing in a twitching heap. Mack crawled away, dragging his injured leg, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed the discarded wrench, raising it high above his head. It came down in a crunch on the thing's head. He kept hitting it and didn't stop until he was sure it was dead. The safe house was silent again, but it no longer felt safe. Mack leaned against the wall, inspecting his mangled leg. The flesh was shredded, the bone visible in places. He tore a strip from his shirt and tied a tourniquet, hissing through clenched teeth. He thought he had some clotting gel in his emergency kit. He rummaged around in it until he found a foil packet and tore it open. It wouldn't be enough to stop all of the bleeding, but would keep him from bleeding out. The wounds the thing had made followed a strange pattern. Perfectly straight lines with abrupt right-angle turns. It looked something like a circuit board cut into flesh, ending with ragged slices from when he jerked his foot away. The air reeked of ozone and burnt flesh. Mack turned to the alien's body, the bioluminescent blood fading to a dull glow. He approached it cautiously, his wrench raised. Now that his wound was handled, he decided to inspect the creature further. Up close it was even more grotesque. Its hands, if they could be called that, were organic but resembled some sort of twisted Swiss Army knife. Scalpel fingers, screwdriver-like appendages, and fine branching tendrils extended from the fibrous, chitinous limbs. Mack realized these weren't tools. They were part of the creature's body. It was a scavenger like him. But it wasn't here to survive. It was here to dissect, to study, to dismantle. He slumped against the wall, his vision blurring from exhaustion and blood loss. The faint whistle returned, distant but growing louder. More were coming. Mack forced himself to his feet, grabbing what supplies he could. His home was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. He limped into the night, leaving the ruined city behind, the eerie whistle echoing in his ears. And in the distance, the orbital elevator loomed, its shadow stretching toward him like a harbinger of worse things to come.